So we will do absolutism today. All right, it's a 4-section of our timeline series, and I would put probably in the top 3, maybe the top 4 of the early half of class, because we got Renaissance, Reformation, Absolutism, and French Rev. Probably have about a third to maybe a half of our key concepts from the first half of class, and most of what we do through these periods, luckily for us, will connect over time. All right, so the first up, I think we should always look at the clusters. In our clusters for absolutism, just like all the other ones, I hate to be too repetitive, but I cannot stress it enough because of synthesis, like you just wrote. Change the status quo. I know that's like the 4th time we've written it, but did anybody use change the status quo for the synthesis you just wrote? Hooper, what'd you say? Just like the Peace of Augsburg, we have the German peasants' revolts. Somebody else, I forget who, said the storming of the Bastille tried to change the status quo, just like these German peasants' revolt. It is a common theme, and you can use it for just about everything. In this case, we are usually changing from church rule or noble rule. Let's say we're changing from church or noble rule to singular. That's absolutism. That's a single person having complete and utter control. Or maybe even a better word would be non-religious, right? What's our word for non-religious? Secular rule. We may reference stuff like divine right, but Louis XIV is not referencing divine right to show that he's just as good as a priest. He's referencing divine right to encourage his control over his people. All right, the last point, the best point for our cluster. If we are looking at the most powerful men in the world, what's our last cluster? It's one of those main points. Anybody use it in their DBQ like I told you to? Machiavellian or virtue. Right? There is no man who has a bigger impact on his country in all of European history than whom? Louis XIV. And this is his chapter. This is the moments. This is the times we get to picture him. All right. Let's start with the some overall points. And I would say first off, kind of synthesis, or let's place it. If we look at the 1500s, you've got 1517 right here. You know the 95 Theses. So you are looking at this era, the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, which means the era after it. It makes sense that people like Louis XIV are taking power from the church, because the church has never been weaker. Right? Above that, if we say mid-1500s to early 1600s, you will always think of whom? Elizabeth. First great woman monarch, not an absolute monarch, but very, very, very powerful, and a good precursor to these ages of singular absolutism in several different countries. All right. So we have, in this era, we have a series of military advancements, which is quite important. So military advancements. All right. There is new technology. There is singular, I don't want to say singular, let's say professional armies. You know what professional army means? Who fought in the American Revolution? Who was the American soldiers in the American Revolution? What? Minutemen, sure. And what did they do most of the time? Farmed, right? When there was a war, there was a battle, there was a time, they'd grab their guns, whatever, go to war. Which is nice. The professional army does this full time, which is good because they can be larger, they are better trained, you can equip them with better technology, better uniforms. What's the downside of having a professional army? It's expensive. So a government that has a professional army has to collect a lot of taxes, it has to have a centralized government, and to run a full-size professional army, what else do you need? You need generals. You need corporals. You need supply officers. You need a whole big what? What? You're right. This is really a key concept or a cluster for this whole chapter. Is this pyramid? I remember Louis XIV going to build his pyramid. All of this is the government control. Yes, do you know the word that goes along with this? It's a tough word to spell. Not hierarchy. That's a good one. Bureaucracy. You guys remember that? Bureaucracy means government. A bigger bureaucracy means more individuals actually in the government, running the government. Along with these military advancements, the other social change. Do you see how military, we're starting to lead into an absolute monarch, right? That singular king is going to have a lot more power. Along with military advancements, in this era, which we've already talked about, but I want to mention again, the economy is changing. Why is the economy changing in the 15, 16, 1700s? Yes. Mercantilism, which is coming into place as a result of what? Cooper. What's our last timeline? Exploration. We have opened up the world. There's a new economy. It changes everything. Along with this new economy comes new economic powerhouses. We have bankers. We have merchants. We have new guilds. All of these people have power. Bankers, merchants especially, they get money. And with money should come what? Power. But it usually doesn't. Because who keeps the power? The old world nobles. And we are developing new nobles that are going to support a new government. It gives us a chance to see absolutism actually grow and flourish. All right. One last big thing before we get to our kings, we should mention 1648. What's one of the biggest consequences of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations? Church splits up, and when you split one group into two groups, what happens when those two groups live on the same continent? You have fighting. And the country that sees the worst of this fighting is which country? Not France, not Germany.
England.
Not England. You got to think older. Prussia doesn't exist yet. Holy Roman Empire. The worst of these wars was from 1618 to 1648. What was that war? The 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War ends in 1648. It ends with something called the... No. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Synthesis here. Darn near 100 years earlier, in 1555, we already talked about it, Sophia was what? Peace of Augsburg. Peace of Westphalia is one of the most important documents that you don't remember. First off, this is the last great push of Catholicism. So you can say this is the end of medieval Catholicism, which usually means, government control and Catholic. It is also the real and true downfall of what? The Holy Roman Empire. And along with the downfall of the Holy Roman Empire, linked together is the downfall of the Habsburgs. One of the way the Habsburgs ruled the Holy Roman Empire is to use religion. But ever since the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, being Protestant has been legal. And the Protestants don't like being ruled by a Roman Catholic Habsburg. So these revolts are only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the last gold star point before our absolutist kings right here is the Peace of Westphalia. From now on, there's not going to be any large-scale religious wars, and the reason there will be wars in Europe from now on is what? is because one country will do what? This is the start of the balance of power. This is the start of balance. We're not fighting wars over religion. We're fighting wars over political and military power. Yes, sir. Habsburgs will rule for another 200 years, but this is their downfall. What impact do the Habsburgs have on society, on Europe after this? Not a big one. All right. If we're going to look at absolutism, we of course need to look at what country? Let's look at France. And let's start not with the big guy. Let's start with the people that come before him. There's Cardinal Richelieu. Can't spell it. And there's, do you remember Louis the 13th? Louis the 13th, especially the Spider King. What these guys tried to do is they tried to control every aspect of society. But what's their biggest obstacle? We learned that the biggest obstacle to absolutism is the nobles. Far and away is the nobles. We also, at the very end of Louis XIII's reign, we see a very important event happen. Louis XIII's reign. We see a very important event happen. That event is what really kind of marks Louis XIV's young life and convinces him that he wants to take complete control of his country because it's what's best for his country. Son, do you remember?
Doesn't like the nobles or the peasants like march to the palace like him and his mother to like?
That's French Rev. He does, however, end up going through another riot. Do you remember the Fronde? It was a riot in the revolts of Paris. It's when they put poo in the slings and shot it at royal carriages. That marks him and teaches him that France needs to change. Louis XIV is going to rule from the mid-1600s until 1715. I think 1648 to 1715. And he's our big boy. What's the if you ever write Louis XIV's name, what should you put right next to him? Sun King. 1715 he does. I don't know that one. Or at least he's done. Sun King is proof not only that he has complete power, that he is going to be the shining sun at the top of this pyramid that not only sees everything going on in his country, but can command all parts of his country and his laws, his commandments go to every part of the country all at once. No hesitation. That's absolute control. It also shows, is the best example of what other term you're always going to put with Louis XIV. Divine right. Machiavellian is a very good guess, but divine right. That's Louis XIV. When you think of Louis XIV and how he takes over, you are always going to think about how he builds the big pyramid of bureaucracy. The big pyramid of bureaucracy and puts himself at the top. He centralizes power. Centralizes power. Puts everything through his... And what's the primary way that he builds this pyramid? The primary way that he convinces nobles to fall in line with his pyramid is he does what? Seduction. He seduces the nobles. Good. Glad I taught you something. What's the best way that Louis XIV seduces the nobles? Versailles. If you get a question about Louis XIV, you're going to mention Versailles too. I think he is the #1 most tested individual on the AP Euro test. When you consider DBQs, essays, and multiple choice questions, his name pops up more than any other name in European history. Yes? Speak up.
We have a short answer, right?
Yes, we will have short answer.
Okay, what kinds of answers would those be?
I will give you examples of them within the next week. We only have a couple, but just a question that requires only a paragraph answer. Okay? We'll get there. So Versailles. I will tell you, near the end of his power, he screws up. Right? Louis XIV does good things. He does deficit spending where he invests in the country. He builds roads. He builds ports. And France becomes the most powerful country in Europe under Louis XIV. But towards the end of his reign, he gets a little bit greedy. What does he do? War of Spanish Succession. Remember, there's a guy who died, I think that's 1712. There's the King of Spain dies, and Louis XIV says, you know what? I'm the most powerful king here. I'm going to go ahead and lay claim to that. There's not a single country in Europe that can stop me. The problem with this plan is what? All of Europe has a problem with that. France would become too powerful, so all of Europe is going to team up and take on Louis XIV and teach that man a lesson. That is Louis XIV. He is probably the most important of all the absolute monarchs. But if I were to ask you who my favorite of all the absolute monarchs was, you would know that it is Peter the Great. So let's look at Peter the Great. Peter the Great is around this same time period. Okay. Really ruling during Louis XIV, maybe a little later. He goes until, I don't know, the 1730s, 1720s. So about the same time. Here's the color. Here's Louis XIV in the background. Peter the Great. What's the problem with Russia when Peter the Great takes over? Everything. It's the most backwards medieval country in the world. And if you had to sum up Peter the Great in one term, one word, what would you say he does with Russia? He westernizer. The great westernizer. There's a couple ways he does it. Remember, he travels around Europe with all his frat buddy friends, visits all the other countries. What's his favorite country?
France.
No. His favorite thing to do is build ships.
Oh, Netherlands.
The Netherlands. Very good. The Netherlands is his favorite country. So, when he lands back from this trip, what's the story you remember of him? The beards. What he's doing when he shaves the beards is he is demonstrating to his people. He's saying, listen, you have beards, you grow beards because the Russian Orthodox Church tells you to. Well, from now on, you may be religious all you want, but you will respect your king's demands above the demands of the church. The other way is he also seduces the nobles. The way that Louis XIV did it is he would invite nobles to his palace at Versailles. He would give them little tiny pieces in his pyramid of bureaucracy, just enough so they felt like they were important, but not enough so they could really take control. In order to get the nobles out of their old castles, out of Moscow, where the nobles in Russia have always felt in power, what does Peter the Great do? He builds St. Petersburg. That is his palace of Versailles. Why else is St. Petersburg important? Trade. It's a port. It's a port. After Peter the Great, who carries on his legacy for the most part? Catherine the Great. Remember we read a section about the enlightened despots, the enlightened absolute monarchs. She is a good example of that. That's Peter the Great. I do want to mention a couple other things here. Prussia. Don't worry about a time. Don't worry about dates for Prussia or the Holy Roman Empire. Just know a couple facts here. As the Holy Roman Empire declines, all the individual countries of the Holy Roman Empire gain more power. It's like what we're talking about in our current unit in the Cold War. As the Soviet Union collapses, the different countries of the old Eastern Bloc start to gain independence and power. As the Soviet Union collapses, some countries like Prussia start to gain power. And we end up with some very powerful kings. You guys remember any of those kings? Frederick William I. Frederick William I, absolute monarch, bringing Prussia into the modern age. He's very military-centered, After he dies, it's Frederick II. These are gray box guys. They're not as important as Louis XIV, but there's a very good chance you'll get questions about them. Do you remember in Austria, the enlightened despot, the absolute monarch? She has a part in the War of Austrian Succession, eventually, not Mary? It's Maria. Maria Theresa. Just recognize those names and that they fall on our absolute monarchy timeline.
So did Austria gain power?
Austria is the one region still strongly controlled by the Habsburgs. And that's true all the way up until Franz Ferdinand is killed and we get into World War I. So I would say no. Yes.
Where did her son Joseph II?
After she died.
I know, like where? Like in Austria?
Yes. Don't quote me on that, but he's not in the key concepts. So I have not done research. The last big one is in fact the opposite of this. In the era of Peter the Great, in the era of Louis XIV, in the era of the greatest absolute monarchs in world history, what country is not following that path? England. In the mid-1600s, England has a what? England has both. The problem is he had both Parliament and the King. The problem is they get into a lot of arguments, right? Do you remember one of the biggest problems after Elizabeth died?
Successor.
She doesn't have an heir to the throne. She doesn't have a successor. So they scramble around for a while. Ultimately, England calls up Scotland, and they get the Stuart family to come rule. You remember the Stuarts? There's 4 people. There's only 2 names. You remember them? James and Charles. I forget the order. I think it's James the First, Charles the First, James the Second, or Charles the Second. James doesn't matter. James and Charles the Stuarts. What are they like? When they show up to Parliament and they stand in front of Parliament on the first day, what do they say? Screw you guys, I'm in charge. They're looking at these other absolute monarchs and these people coming about, and they want absolute control. And what does Parliament say? Now, unlike the Estates General in France, unlike whatever is in Russia, the Parliament of England has real power. They have real power and real influence. Ever since the Magna Carta. Do you know when the Magna Carta was in England? It was 1200! Way ahead of the other countries. That's why they won't be seduced by absolutism. They will resist it. Well, Stuarts don't like that, so they go up north, they rally a bunch of nobles together, get an army. Parliament at the bottom gets an army. We have an English Civil War for about 10 years or so. You remember the parliamentarians versus the Roundheads, the Cavaliers versus... Roundhead versus Cavaliers, and then the parliamentarians versus, I don't know, the monarchists. You don't need to know them. But that's the English Civil War if it rings a bell. Okay. Another name I would throw in there is at the end of the English Civil War, Parliament wins. The problem is they just fought a civil war, so they're really kind of scrambling. And who ends up in charge? Oliver Cromwell. Right? Oliver Cromwell is a military dictator. He's not really well liked. Do you remember why he's not liked? He's got several policies. He is very religious. For example, he outlaws sports, right? Outlaws sports. He's basically a Puritan. Outlaws sports and stuff because it goes against a lot of his religious beliefs. People don't like him. They eventually kick him out. When they kick him out, they invite the Stuarts back. And they're like, Stuart, you're going to be nice now, right? And the Stuarts are like, yeah, I'm totally going to be nice. And the first time a Stuart king stands in front of Parliament, what does he say? Screw you guys, I'm in charge. So we get angry for a while, he dies, another guy comes along. In the end, I think it's James II is the last one. In the end, the Stuarts in Parliament realizes they're heading towards another civil war. And they both agree. Parliament won't arrest and kill the king as long as the king does what? Abdicates. Steps down from power, runs away. So he steps down from power, runs away from France, and England is like, all right, great, Parliament's powerful, but we still need a king. They get a king from where?
Netherlands.
The Netherlands, who is William and Mary. What's their last name? What's their house name? Of Orange. For that reason, if you had to look at other countries that were not seduced by absolutism, always think of the Netherlands. Always think of Holland. The Dutch. Because if we got good kings from them, we know that's not it. What is that era called? I should have put these guys over here. The Glorious Revolution. Why is it called the Glorious Revolution? No blood. It was peaceful. So that's where we have William and Mary. I do want to mention something, a white box term. I didn't stress it when we taught it in class. Because of the power Parliament shows, and because of the temptation of kings to become absolute monarchs, England passes the English what? Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights.
Do you know when that was?
Say it again?
Do you know when that was?
No, but it's going to be late 1600s in England. There's two people I want to mention. They don't fit with absolutism, but they fit with this time period. Name a man who was writing books during the English Civil War. Thomas Hobbes. His most famous book, Leviathan. Right? How did Hobbes view human nature? He said that the state of nature, real life, is what? Nasty, brutish, and short. Why does he have those views he's writing during the English Civil War? The grumpy old man. Who is writing during the Glorious Revolution? Locke. He believes when you are born, you are not naturally greedy. You are a what? Tabula rasa, or tabula rasa. You're a blank slate. You are created by your experiences. So if you are raised in a loving household, you will become a loving child and a loving person. Little more positive view on society. And the last point that I would like to make is that though Louis the Great makes France the most powerful country in Europe, when he dies in 1715, what happens to France? They will start to fall until the French Revolution. And one of the best examples of this is in the 1760s. Right? What happens with England after they go through their Civil War and Glorious Revolution? What happens with them? We love William and Mary. They're good rulers. England is now on the rise. It's one of the greatest transitions in European history, perhaps the greatest. The decline of France is the greatest country, and the rise of England. It's why we speak English and not French. What happens in the 1760s? You guys know because you learned it last year. What event? The 7 Years' War, or as it's known in America, the French and Indian War. England wins that war. So for the first real official time in a while, England is greater than France. And it's going to stay like that for a long, long time. Any questions?